All right, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you for being here today. I'm Dr. Megan Holmes. I'm a professor of social work and founding director of the Center on Trauma University. I now serve as the co-director of Center on Trauma University. I've been at the Mandel School for 13 years. Very happy to be here this morning. There's fidget baskets, feel free to grab one. My son is in the back, Lucas. So if you need him to run you a fidget, he can run you too. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump in. So let me start with a moment that I think many of us can recognize. So you're in a meeting, someone raises a concern, and it's immediately dismissed. A few people glance around and go quiet. So no one says it out loud, but the energy shifts, and suddenly it's clear. This isn't a space where people feel safe to speak up. So I'm going to venture that most of us have been in a room like that. Maybe as a similar circumstance or something slightly different, but you feel that safety go away. And whether we realize it or not, our nervous systems are responding to that moment. Our brains are beginning to scan for threat, and we move from connection to protection. And that's not just a moment of awkwardness when the room goes silent. It's really a leadership breakdown. And it's far more common than we think. So we're in the midst of a leadership crisis, not just at the national level, but across organizations. So not because people don't care or aren't trying, but because the systems and models that many of us inherited or were trained in are fundamentally outdated. They're rooted in this command and control thinking. So manage behavior, track productivity, enforce compliance. And these approaches might have worked in a hierarchical industrial era context, but they're incompatible with today's relational, fast changing, and often high pressured workplaces. At the same time, burnout is pervasive. So turnover is rising and disengagement is rampant across all different sectors, not just social work. So disengagement alone costs the US companies hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Employees who are disengaged, they miss more work, they contribute less, and are more likely to leave the organization. On an individual level, the cost per disengaged employee can reach $10,000 in lost productivity each year. And then there's burnout, driven by that sustained stress and lack of support. That adds to the crisis. So contributing an estimated $300 billion in global costs annually. During the pandemic, which feels like maybe a long time ago, but was not so long ago, it took a toll on morale, mental health, and performance intensified during that period. So those organizations without strong supportive leadership structures struggle to really maintain that cohesion. Additionally, toxic cultures accelerated this decline. So environments where there was bullying, where there's exclusion, where inaction goes unchecked, damages that morale and erodes trust. Once that trust is broken, the team's unraveled, right? So these aren't just HR problems, they're leadership problems. And when people are overwhelmed or disconnected, it's not a sign of weakness. It's often a reflection of the environment that we've created within the organization. And then if we just add another layer to this, the hybrid work really has magnified these cracks within the systems. So many leaders are still trying to supervise through outdated systems that prioritize output over relationships and control over connection. But our brains just don't respond well to control in times of stress. Our brains respond to trust, responds to predictability, and it responds to relational attunement. So the good news is that there is a better way forward. So by integrating principles on neuroscience, trauma-informed care, and relational capacity, we can build leadership models that support both people and performance. So let's go back to that meeting that I talked about at the very beginning. So one person took a risk. They spoke up. The response was that they were shut down, right? And maybe that was unintentional, but the signal was still sent to them. This isn't safe. What happened next wasn't emotional, that silencing of the room, it was neurological. And so our nervous system shifts from curiosity to self-protection in those moments. You could feel the energy of that room contract, right? If you were emotionally attuned to what was going on, you probably felt it. And that's what traditional leadership often misses. It assumes that performance is separate from the psychology, that strategy alone can carry a culture, that outcome matters more than relationships. But the truth is, people don't disengage because a strategic plan isn't clear. They disengage because they don't feel safe, seen, or supported in the organization. So this is why we need to reframe leadership, not as a top-down directed function, but really as a relational regulatory role. In many workplaces, we still operate with this command and control expectation. So get it done. Don't question too much. Push harder when things aren't working. Spend more time at work. But in high stress, high changing environments, those tactics really backfire. They don't regulate the system, they escalate it. Trauma-informed leadership asks, what does this environment need in order for people to show up fully? And it starts with you as the leader, as the regulatory anchor for the organization in the room. Your presence, your tone, your pacing, even your facial expressions, they send signals to the people that you're working with. You are co-regulating your team, whether you mean to or not. So leadership today is more about is more than delivering results. It's about creating conditions where results are possible. It's not strategy versus care, it's strategy rooted in care. It's leading with the brain and the body in mind. So let's go deeper into the neuroscience behind all of this. So there are three major functional areas of the brain when we're considering human behavior and stress response. The survival brain, which is also called the reptilian brain, that's located in the lower red highlighted area, which includes the brainstem and the cerebellum. This is the most primitive part of our brain. It's responsible for essential survivor functions, such as heart rate, breathing, body temperature regulation. And it's sometimes called the reptilian brain because it evolved first. It's shared with all vertebrates. The emotional brain, also called the limbic system, is located in the middle orange highlighted area, and that includes the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. And the limbic system is responsible for our emotions, our memory, and our stress regulation. The thinking brain, also called the neocortex, is located at the upper blue highlighted area. So this is the most advanced and involved part of the brain. It's responsible for higher order thinking, for reasoning, for self-control, planning, and problem solving. What's important to understand is that all information is processed from bottom up. This means before we can think rationally, before we can use our prefrontal cortex, we have to have access and regulate survival, sensory, and emotional responses. So when we are in what's called a regulated state, there's no threat in our environment, nothing that we take in from our senses that may ring our stress alarm. All parts of our brain are communicating and working together. The survival brain keeps us breathing and moving and blood pumping. Our emotional brain manages what comes up emotionally, while our cortex and thinking brain tackles the more complex things like making plans, problem solving, remembering what you need from, for example, the grocery store. This is a system that's integrated and coherent. And so here you see, hey, thinking brain, hope you're doing well. Just wanted to let you know that everything is going okay over here, no threat. That is your emotional brain. The thinking brain responds saying, thanks, emotional brain, I appreciate that. I'll just keep doing my abstract thinking, reasoning, and making decisions, right? However, once a threat is perceived, the amygdala and the emotional brain sounds the alarm. All energy goes towards prioritizing our survival. What this means is that the cortex, your thinking brain, essentially goes offline for reasoning and impulse control, attention and emotional regulation. So the cortex focuses on assessing whether the situation is truly a threat, working closely with the amygdala, who's determining whether or not to continue to activate our stress response system. Majority of the communication is occurring between the emotional and survival portions. So in short, your prefrontal cortex pretty much goes offline when you're experiencing high stress. So here's the thing. When we encounter stress or challenges, our brain doesn't always respond logically. It responds based on its current state. And this is what we call state-dependent functioning, which explains why our ability to regulate emotions, to solve problems, and even engage in relationships shifts during our levels of stress. So let's explore how the different brain states affect behavior and why people react so differently under stress. So state-dependent functioning means that the way we think, feel, and behave depends on the state of our nervous system. So when we are calm and regulated, we have access to our full, beautiful brains. We can problem solve, we can control impulses, and we can connect with others. But when we experience moderate stress, the emotional brain, the limbic system, it takes over, making us more reactive, making us more impulsive, more emotionally sensitive. When stress becomes overwhelming or potentially traumatic, we shift into survival mode. We're down in our brainstem, that red region, right? We're thinking, where our thinking and our emotional control shuts down in favor of instinctual responses like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. So this explains why some people react calmly to stress while others panic, shut down, and lash out. It's not a choice, it is a conditioned response within our body. So let's go back to that meeting moment. One person spoke up, gets dismissed, the room shifts, right? Let's explain this through the neuroscience. The amygdala in our emotional brain kicked in, right? Every person in that room felt that shift. That's the part that's scanning for threat, the physical and the emotional threat. The moment somebody feels dismissed, rejected, or uncertain, that brain flips from connection to protection. And this isn't about being thin-skinned, it's about how humans are actually wired. We are biologically wired to respond this way, to protect ourselves. The brain doesn't distinguish between physical and emotional threats. It only asks, am I okay right now? And if you are emotionally feeling not okay, it's sending that stress alarm signal. So that the answer is no, the prefrontal cortex, that part that's responsible for reflection, for problem solving and collaboration, it essentially goes offline. And what takes over instead is our survival response, to shut down, to lash out. Yeah.
I have a question. So with the last bullet point about severe and chronic stress locking the brain, you keep reading a lot in the news about like high cortisol. That seems to be one of the health trends. And I agree with it that it's stress related, but can someone kind of remain in that locked state if they're constantly under stress? So think about like a first responder or a new parent, right? That the child is waking up all the time.
It's a good question. So I teach a whole semester on this topic. But in short, the answer is yes, especially if you experience it from younger ages. When you are stressed, your body is flooded with cortisol, that's your stress hormone, and it triggers your stress response system. So there's a lot of parts of the body that get engaged in that part. But in short, yes, it floods your body and then it lowers your level of stress that you need in order for that to be re-engaged. And so kiddos who have experienced traumatic experiences early on in life, they tend to be in that state continuously, which then has later impacts on health and well-being.
Well, that's the answer I anticipated. Thank you.
Okay, so our survival response shuts down, it lashes out, we tend to over-explain and we withdraw, right? And this is happening silently all the time. It's happening in meetings, it's happening in one-on-one conversations, it's happening perhaps through emails when you get something that feels unsafe, right? It's why one moment of dismissal can impact an entire team's energy. So psychological safety isn't just about being kind, it's the precondition for collaboration, for innovation, and for learning. And the neuroscience backs this up. So when safety is absent, cortisol floods our bodies, right? It floods our systems, the brain becomes reactive, it becomes cautious, and it becomes limited in its capacity to use those higher level of thinking. When safety is present, the brain releases oxytocin and dopamine. Those are our feel-good hormones, right? And so it's a chemical that fosters trust. It fosters openness, and it helps us focus better. Trust and inclusion aren't just values, they're biological necessities for learning and growth. And if someone doesn't feel like they belong, their brain is constantly scanning for threat. So you're constantly in that survival or emotional brain area. And that's exhausting. It's exhausting. So over time, it leads to this disengagement and burnout. So as leaders, our job is to create a space where people can bring their full self to it. Not just because it's ethical, but because it's essential to performance and to retention. So let's not ask people to do this deep relational work in unsafe environments, right? Let's start by creating safety, and then everything else becomes possible. This is why this idea of just power through it, leadership, really fails. It's biologically misaligned with what people need in order to function well. And here's the leadership insight. So psychological safety is not created by intention, it's created by impact, by your own impact. And you might believe that your team can speak freely within meetings or to each other, but if their nervous systems say otherwise, that's what's going to shape their behavior. That's why that meeting shut down so quickly. Not because people didn't care, but because their brains told them it was not safe to keep up. So how do we create these environments where people can stay regulated, engaged, and open? So let's first start with how threat actually shows up in behavior. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with these work, if you've done any trauma-informed work. We talk about 4 classic survival responses. Fight, in a work situation like this, might look like defensiveness, irritability, micromanaging, or conflict escalation. Fight can show up as withdrawal, avoidance, flight can show up as withdrawal, avoidance, absenteeism, and it can show up as overworking or task. Freeze often presents as indecisiveness, dissociation, flat affect, or sudden drops in performance, silence, or disengagement. And then fawn might look like people pleasing. It might look like overworking. It might look like over accommodating, not maintaining boundaries, or suppressing needs in order to really maintain whatever little harmony exists within organizations. So these show up in organizations all the time. And we often label them as attitude issues or performance problems, but they're often more than that. They're the nervous system trying to stay safe, right? An individual's nervous system trying to stay safe. These responses are not conscious choices. They're automatic and they're physiological responses to that perceived threat. And remember that threat doesn't have to be physical, right? It could be a critical supervisor. It could be unclear expectations. It could be a chaotic team environment or chronic unpredictability. And here's what's important to understand. These aren't personality flaws, right? They're their protective patterns. And the workplace often reinforces them. So, for example, a team member who always agrees with the leadership, even when something's off, may be that fawn response, right? Someone who's always saying yes and never pushes back, a colleague who does this, that might not be loyalty, it might be fear. The person who shuts down in a meeting, they might be frozen. That might not be them being unmotivated. So I had someone tell me once, I used to offer ideas, but no one acknowledged them. So eventually I just stopped trying. So that's not disengagement, that's what protection looks like, right? When their nervous system is shutting down. So as a leader, our role is to recognize the difference between dysregulation and defiance. And here's the key, if leaders don't understand these patterns, they're likely to misinterpret them and respond in ways that escalate the threat response instead of soothing it. And as a leader, we must learn to recognize what I'm seeing might not be resistance. It might be the nervous system doing its best to stay safe. So this is the beginning of trauma-informed leadership. So reading behaviors through a lens of stress, not through a lens of performance. And that includes your own behaviors too. So think for a moment, what's your default survival pattern under stress? Do you overfunction? Do you get short? Do you avoid conflicts? That's all really important data. So understanding these patterns also help us reflect on our own responses when we're feeling stress. As a leader, we are vulnerable too to stress response. And when we're unaware of them, we can unintentionally escalate and mirror the very behaviors we're trying to manage. So when people experience warmth, presence, and attunement, the brain releases that oxytocin that I talked about earlier. That's our bonding hormone. So oxytocin promotes trust, it eases anxiety, and it enhances our ability to relate. It literally builds a neurological foundation for belonging. And at the same time, our brains are full of these mirror neurons, the cells that light up when we tune into other people's emotions. So this is what makes leadership so powerful, but also curious. Our nervous system shapes theirs, right? It shapes the people of the spaces that you're in. When you walk into a room regulated, grounded, and present, the people feel it. When you walk in stressed, short, detached, they feel that too, even if nothing is said. And this is what I mean when I say leaders are co-regulators. So you are the emotional barometer for your team, not by choice, but by biology. This is why presence matters more than perfection, why your tone matters more than your to-do list and what you're checking off of it. Connection literally changes brain chemistry. It boosts dopamine, which increases motivation. It regulates that cortisol flux, decreasing chronic stress, and it strengthens trust, resilience, and the capacity to think clearly under pressure. So have you ever had this meaningful, maybe one-on-one conversation that you walked away just with like this extra bounce in your step, like fully energized? That's not just a good moment. That's your neurobiology responding to safety. And when that happens consistently, trust compounds, people engage, they start to take risks, and they bring their full selves to the table, not out of obligation, but because they feel safe enough to. So when I talk about building a culture of connection, I'm not talking about fluff. I'm talking about strategy that's really rooted in physiology. In high stress environments, connection is protective. It buffers against burnout, it enables creativity, and it builds relational infrastructures that performance depends on. So the question becomes for you, what kind of nervous system am I creating through how I lead my teams, my organization, my groups? So I'm going to pause here and actually invite you into a reflection. So I want you to take a few minutes and reflect on this prompt, either with a partner or in a small group. So think about a time you felt psychologically safe at work. What did that look like? What created that sense of safety for you? Maybe it was a supervisor who gave you space to be honest, a team that welcomed your input without judgment, or a moment that someone truly saw you, not just your role, but your full self. And after you share those stories, explore the flip side. What shuts down psychological safety for you? What signals that it's not safe to speak up? or not safe to take risks. So this isn't just about having a nice environment, it's about how safety is built or broken in these micro moments of interactions. And it's deeply personal, right? What feels safe to one person might feel threatening to another person. And it depends on our lived experiences as well as our identity. And our brain prioritizes that survival over reflection. So if someone is quiet, reactive, or guarded, it might not be about them at work. It might be about whether their environment feels safe, right? Okay, so take a few minutes, chat with the people around you to answer these questions. What does safety look like?
You like to talk about already, that's all. That's good. You wanna do large, small? No, I support.
No, I think. That's something that I think.
I also always want to do the false, right? And 80% is just like me, it's like, I really say, like, execute yourself as the, and I like rode that high for the rest of the day. And I was like, oh yeah, it did like really trigger something. It didn't hurt me in the moment that was like a chemical reaction. It totally was.
I think I'm at a private practice right now, a lot of this stuff. Yeah. I have a client now, he's just talking about how he's having a hard time finding his.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, I'm thinking. So this is just a form of bond, three of us. And I was a spokesperson all the time, so I always. My, so I could speak, yeah, so I could speak out and try to make change, cause I know everything's just not perfect. It doesn't matter. That's you know, anybody else, but that's not the way. And plus, is that what saying about us? That's for a little. Some people get they get great job. The fear, so that our department wasn't made. So I feel respect all for but that's still have like that's just how I just had a like for really like something and knowing how to talk, personality that's what you'll yeah. I worked for 2 years and it's just
when did it? Have you been? Wow. It's funny how I didn't.
Yeah,
I take the my class in my acceptance letter as like a fair housing. Page,
it's not innovation.
Yeah. Yeah, so I have extended. So they pretty much as long as our program, some type of young classes here. Yeah, so there'll be like, we'll have like responsibilities and like helping clean the house. And everyone's that's great. Good for the entire house.
So I think my grade is always just known, but I'm sitting in these meetings and they say,
Oh, yeah.
like, and then the guy.
International, I'm one of the.
That
It's just starting to be.
Those like it was out, but a little bit now.
I like graduating in my. The content, like, I like. Before, but I hit.
I mean, things like. It was big, yeah, very, very great. So I didn't follow it.
It's.
I didn't follow it.
Put up,
I'm just thinking about how you participate, and it's not like, it's.
You go.
That's.
Okay. Yeah.
About my reaction. All.
okay, I'm here to play.
Type role slash. So. Whether I'm trained. So make sure they're safe. Full time. I was, I read. Toxic.
But you
And so as the surprising a lot of people. One of the, one of part of the story is my openness to think of the process. What is that? Encouraged me, and I say, you know what I'm saying? As an adult, you don't know what I'm dealing with. I know. But I didn't have an opportunity to mom of the senior. So this weekend. And I mean, it was what it was. And I I'm getting my own friend. I was getting my own friend. When someone, he got his own friend, right? Something happening. And it was because he saw something. It was like, you know, it's tough seeing. It's tough to bother, you know, there's tough to bother. You're already. It be, I didn't say never really. It's like, yes, I'm ready to go. I respond. I'll warm up. And I'll want to hear that.
Because I was part-time, you had. Like, I couldn't take it.
I had a visitor, she was talking, I've never heard of falling. I've always heard of fighting, like, it's free. Yeah. And because
But I still.
like, okay. Okay. When it's not. Like, it's regulated. I feel it, people already. Where's I, what you got to say, no matter. So whatever you tell me to do, even if it don't make sense. There are always. Mary also asked how to decide in that type of experience, you know, kind of talking about opportunities. Yeah, and realize my first time, but is, you know, was very trained. That's just supervisory. It's very, when you're really on a project, it's always that, yeah, in a book. Oh, okay. Absolutely. I mean, that's just like, I agree. So I don't tire.
The title of that.
Really great. That's probably like.
I want to.
That's actually Steve. Higher up the food chain and. This for the outlet.
It's like, yes.
That's one of those. Trauma is that. It had been somebody.
Oh,
It had nothing to do with my performance.
I didn't, yeah, I guess this summer was I wasn't,
I think that's it, yeah, but.
I think it was 6 to 10.
Yes.
It's kind of late.
Yeah, that was very interesting. That's why I was like, we got. No, they need to kind of just be about fresh. Your mom. It's nice to meet
No.
Discussion's good.
I love that you're all relationally connected. You can just bring that Airbnb. All right, so let's hear a couple themes that came up. The questions, you don't have to share the exact scenario. In fact, it'd probably be safer to not share the exact scenario that you may have shared in your small groups. But what are some of the themes about how to build trust? What erodes trust? And then what maybe simple behaviors make differences? So you can answer any of those. Let's hear from several of the groups.
I mean, the big one for me was, assuming positive intent of a supervisor, like, because I had a very draft, like, in prior jobs. Clearly from their reaction did not assume that I was being positive, and now I'm one that does. And just the feeling of being with a supervisor, assuming positive intent is just like, it's so warming, like inside of me, I just feel like, oh.
I felt your warmth. Yeah, assuming positive intent. That's a great. What else?
Well, I was just, sharing that when you were doing the fight, flight, freeze, I had never heard bond. I've never, that was
That
the
is one
first
that
time
doesn't
I've
get
seen
talked
it.
about a lot.
And I was like, oh, that's me. Because when you're in a meeting and you feel that moment where it's like, oh, you don't really care about what I'm saying, you just want us to say yes to you, that's what I do. I'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, so the rest of the meeting is, okay, and it's just, because it's exhausting to try to get a point across that clearly doesn't wanna be, they don't
Yes.
wanna receive, they've already made up their mind. It's like, sometimes I'm like, why are you doing a meeting? You've already made up your mind of everything you wanna do. Send an email, tell us what the job is that you want us to do so we can get it done.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize, so that just really opened up something for me.
What else?
Another one that came up in our group is when you like offer a suggestion or share something and then you're shut down and then just told, you don't need to know why, just no. Like not even like honoring the request with like some kind of an explanation. Sometimes no is the right answer, but like I'm an adult, like you can at least share with me like why is the no the answer?
We talked about that a little bit in terms of how really healthy leadership can say in a moment, we have to go in a direction that I think many people at this table don't agree with. And there's a lot to talk about with that. If we are going to, unfortunately, have to act, have to do for these reasons, and it's gonna be hard. Like just acknowledging the hard, you're talking about being curious about having curiosity can make you a leader who can also, be like a participatory management leader. Like, I hear you, I hear all of you. We are gonna keep processing that. And we unfortunately have to meet this deadline with this rule that it's gonna be hard for half the people at this table. And just hearing you hear someone saying they understand your thoughts and just change how you.
Yeah, just adding to it, knowing expectations. So having very clear expectations and then seeing that they're upheld in the way that you expect.
We talked a little bit about a psychologically safe place at work being a place where your leader is kind of absorbing or moderating or mediating all of the politics so that you're welcome to just lean into your role. and how that can also create a culture of that values creativity and innovation and really allows you to enjoy that you're doing because you don't have to be preoccupied with interpersonal relationships that are tenuous or the politics of the organization at large.
We also, or I kind of talked about feeling heard and how important it is for me to operate, I guess in my best self when I am being heard. So I talked about how I was at one private practice and just how I felt it just wasn't safe. So I know my performance wasn't the best versus now I'm at a different place and I recall being in, certain meetings and they'll say, oh, that's a great idea. And I'm just like, so then that's how I operate better with my clients. So I'm just making sure that I'm being present and hearing what they're saying without coming up with my own judgment and things like that. I think that creates a safe environment when people feel heard, even if you don't agree, even if it is a no.
And you're coming into state dependent functioning there too. Right? So you're able to move from that emotional rate to your frequent. And have that more creativity, intuition, and be better connected.
Question that I might weave into where we go from here. When we talk trauma informed, we're thinking that we don't know the experience of the people we're impacting or talking to, right? But when we talk about these fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, it's everybody's reaction to something coming at them, right? But we're not assuming in this that everyone has experienced trauma. I just go
Yes
with
and no.
so with the trauma assumption versus.
So if I put on my co-director Center of Trauma and Diversity hat, I will say, most people have experienced some traumatic event in their lifetime, right? The numbers are huge. It's like 86% have experienced at least one. When you look at college data, it's 85 to 95% of our college students are experiencing traumatic events. All of us in the room went through the pandemic, and that is a collective trauma. So from that stance, yes. You don't have to have that lens on though, because if you just step directly into the neurobiology field, this is how our body responds to stress, any stress. It could be walking across the street and a car starts coming at you, that's your stress level engaged, you go into survival mode. Then you have to walk into a meeting with your boss and he says one little thing and you are already elevated. And so then your survival mode kicks in even more, right? So it doesn't have to do with a traumatic experience you experienced early on in life, but it could. So trauma informed, yes, we come from this understanding that most people have experienced trauma and that impacts how they function at work. But from this framework, we're just looking at the understanding of our physiological response to any type of stress. And it falls into those 4 categories when we respond. All right, so all of these insights really help us guide us into the next section, which is what trauma-informed leadership looks like in action. So let's take what we just explored, what safety feels like and what shuts us down, and look more about how it plays out in real-time leadership moments. So in trauma-informed leadership models, our role is to recognize that these responses are not resistance, but they're signs of stress. So they're not random behaviors shaped by the systems, the stress, and often these unspoken expectations. Our job as a leader is to not fix people. Our job is to create the conditions where the nervous system can settle so that their strengths can emerge. And that begins with your own regulation. So your presence is the intervention. The reality is that many people in leadership roles, especially these mission-driven fields, are chronically overextended. So we carry the weight of other people's needs on our shoulders. We navigate these constant changes, particularly with this administration. We often feel the pressure to be the one holding it all together. And this is where burnout begins, right? When leaders burn out, it just doesn't affect them, it ripples across the whole team. So dysregulation at the top sets the tone for the entire system. And this is the paradigms. You know that all these trauma-informed tools, but if your own nervous system is dysregulated, your team's gonna feel it. Leadership is a well-being practice. It's not just what you do, but it's how you do it. So this means your tone in a stressful moment, your ability to pause before reacting, your boundaries, your clarity, your pacing. All of these are leadership behaviors that either regulate or dysregulate the system around you. And when leaders burn out, the system often follows. So your well-being is not extra, it's actually structural to the organization. And let's reframe what it means to model well-being. It is not bubble baths or inspirational quotes or spending hours doing yoga. It's actually honoring your own limits and making those visible to your team, so others know that it's okay to have those limits too. It's about naming when something's hard and then regulating through and not over that discomfort that you're experiencing. And it's also about modeling rest, reflection, realignment in a world that glorifies overworking. Because when you model these boundaries with clarity and care, you create the psychological permission for others to do the same. When you breathe, your team breathes. When you ground, your team settles. And when you rest, your team feels allowed to rest too, which is really important. So ask yourself, where am I stretching beyond my own capacity in ways that are unsustainable? What messages am I sending to my team about urgency, perfection, self-sacrifice? And what shift would I blend with the presence rather than pressure? Modeling well-being doesn't mean being perfectly great. It means showing that it's okay to pause, to take that breath, to name the limits with compassion and clarity when you're experiencing it. It means normalizing these healthy boundaries. As a leader, it's actually a strength. It's not a liability. And this is especially important in cultures where overwork is really seen as a badge of honor. Like, I worked a 60-hour week, or I'm working through the weekend, or I took on 12 extra clients, right? It's not a badge of honor. So in trauma-informed systems, we redefine high performance, not as this constant output, but as a sustainable contribution that's rooted in safety, in clarity, and connection. And when you lead in ways that honor your own capacity, you give permission to others to do the same. The more regulated you are, the more your team can co-regulate with you, right? So tools for co-regulation and leadership might include regulating ourselves first, right? So we always start with ourselves before we engage with dysregulated team members. Slowing the pace at which we talk in meetings, if you're sensing that the room is getting dysregulated. Taking a breath before you respond to a question. Naming the tension in the room with common clarity. So the example that Joni gave before, this is a tough conversation we're gonna have another place. Example of this. Creating more space in meetings for reflection, not just updates. And then really practicing consistency. So not perfection, but having predictability so your team knows what to expect. And then perhaps one of the most important ones that I think often gets missed with leaders is being willing to repair. So if a rupture happens, someone feels dismissed, unheard, or unseen, having that ability to really circle back and say, hey, I noticed something felt off from that conversation, and I wanted to check in about it. That does a huge amount to repair that relationship, and it is totally a trauma-informed. This work isn't about avoiding this discomfort, it's about learning how to hold that discomfort without punishing vulnerability. And it also requires us to do this internal work. So we must track our own nervous system states and learn what activates us, right? So if you know you fall into one of those 4 categories and how you commonly respond, taking a breath and figuring out how to regulate yourself before entering what might be a tough conversation. If a staff member's behavior triggers your frustration, think about whether it's a boundary issue or if you're experiencing your own stress response to something that's going on. Trauma-informed leadership is about cultivating capacity to stay grounded in the face of other people's dysregulation. So that's the key, right? Really practicing that. And it's the ability to meet reactivity with steadiness. So not to absorb it, not to elevate it, and not to ignore it, but to respond with presence and clarity. And this isn't about rescuing people. It's not about excusing harmful behavior. It's about leading in a way that considers the human nervous system and recognizes that regulation, not reactivity, earns that trust. So if we zoom out from the individual leadership to the broader culture of the organization, because we know leadership isn't just about these one-on-one interactions, right? It's about the systems we shape. It's about the signals in those systems that we set. And we can think about the organizational culture similar to a nervous system. So in regulated cultures, people take risks, they speak up, they recover from mistakes. In dysregulated cultures, people brace, they go silent, and they do what feels safe, only what feels safe for them. And here's the thing, you can help regulate the system through how you supervise, how you meet with individuals, and how you communicate. Every routine interaction becomes either that moment of co-regulation or that moment that escalates the threat within the organization. And if we bring it down to this daily level of interactions, we can ask ourselves these questions that are up on the screen. So how do I open meetings? Is there time for a check-in? A time for people to relationally connect with each other? That builds safety in the room. Are the expectations clear for those meetings? Or do they constantly shift? It could not even be a meeting, it could be just the general expectations that you're giving on a daily basis. Do people in your organization know how to name stress and tension and still feel safe to do so? To be able to say, I'm feeling a little dysregulated, and I'm going to take a sip of water and think about how I'm going to respond to that question. Do my systems reward urgency, perfection, and overwork? Or do they make space for reflection and flexibility? Right? So these are these micro moments that you can have impact within the culture of your organization. We can't ask people to self-care their way through the systems that are fundamentally unsafe, right? It really starts with that safety. And well-being is not an individual responsibility, it is a leadership and system responsibility. Culture gets built into those micro moments. So begin staff meetings with grounding or connection moments, right? Build in time for reflective questions, not just status updates. Normalize feedback as a tool for growth, not just punishment. Make boundaries and flexibility. So that needs to be part of the conversation, not just perks for individuals who advocate the hardest. And over time, these norms, these micro moments then shape the norms, right? It shapes the culture that we have within our organization. You don't have to redesign the whole organization, but you can start with where you have power within your own interactions with individuals. So normalize breaks. How many of you take a lunch break? So normalize taking lunch breaks, right? Normalize not responding to emails after hours or on weekends. Honor these boundaries, model that reflection, offer people voice and choice, right? Yeah.
Let's give an example of how I've seen this work out. So I meet with about 12 students a week individually. And I always start our meetings with we have a little check-in. I call it our 3-2-1 check-in. So it's 3 things they're thankful for, 2 words to describe how they're feeling, and 1 way that one instance where they showed up as their best self in the last week. And it's interesting now that I meet with them over the course of a year, they now come into the meeting saying, I've been thinking about the answer to these questions. So it's even teaching them to think about gratitude and those kind of things, even outside of our meeting time, baking it kind of into the way they think.
Beautiful. That's great.
So we have to look beyond this interpersonal level, and we have to ask about the systemic conditions that are creating burnout, disconnection, and fear. And sometimes leadership means pushing back on unrealistic demands. Sometimes it means redesigning workflows that have been in existence for a very long time, or advocating for policy changes that center human dignity. Because no amount of mindfulness or breathing techniques or exercises will fix a system that is fundamentally unsustainable, right? And so that's why I say this well-being is not an individual responsibility, it's a leadership and system responsibility. And the good news is that culture is built 1 choice at a time, right? So 1 meeting, 1 conversation, 1 model moment at a time. And when you model these shifts consistently, others follow, right? Because people don't learn culture from a handbook. They learn it from how it feels to be in the room. Okay, so let's apply what we've covered today. So thinking about the neuroscience, the response to stress, trauma responses, thinking about co-regulation as a leader in the real world leadership moments. So here's the scenario. Imagine your organization has just undergone a major change. That major change could be anything. It could be a leadership shift, a program cut, policy change that affects your team. In the days and weeks that follow, you notice that your team is struggling. So some people are openly angry. They're expressing frustration at meeting, they're questioning decisions, and maybe even they're undermining leadership. Others have gone quiet. They're missing meetings, they're withdrawing from conversations, and they just seem checked out. So you know this change was necessary, but you also know that something else is happening beneath the surface. So as a leader, what do you do in this scenario? And this is where trauma-informed leadership really comes in. So we're gonna break into small groups and explore this. You can join the same group or a different group, it's up to you. So thinking about these 3 questions, what signs of dysregulation do you see in the scenario? So what behaviors are showing up? And what might be being communicated? What might be underneath this withdrawal or anger that I mentioned? The second question is, what regulation strategies could you use personally and as a leader to help stabilize your team? So we're thinking about specific language or tone or strategies that could help reground the team. Think about co-regulation tools that we talked about, communication strategies, transparency, pacing, any of those. And then what would you avoid doing because it could escalate or reinforce? So you don't have to find the perfect solution. What we're trying to look at is how you would apply it, these topics to the scenario. So you can go ahead and break out. We'll spend about 10 minutes and then we'll come back and talk about these, okay?
One of the other people.
I just thought it was an interesting thing to do. So you can do that things.
Live in this right now, so I want to hear your input.
But well, I forgot to do that. But we're meeting here. There's something like that.
Oh, like what?
This is my phone.
And if by responses, what actions would you see?
We know they're dysregulated.
More likely to like.
I don't know if you was like having like that. Talking about how they're angry, I don't think that's fair, that's part of.
But I mean, and I'm like.
Oh, yeah, I'm saying, I'm like, exactly, that's right now. I understand.
Like that.
I mean, there is, what's the best place of way? So I don't know, I think it's.
So I got a lot of. As the house.
About a leader that did.
Some of my. But I think. You know, makes it better.
So. Yeah, you can't know how it.
I love, yeah.
That's what it was.
And they have to take a picture.
All the things
To say.
So that was.
That's the way that it
I value it.
I know that we're messing around. Sometimes, but that was
You
just.
can't help it, it's about.
my job.
And it's. That I think it's. Yeah.
Sorry.
All the dysregulation. And then the strategies that you.
I don't want
to try to say better understand it. It get you back, yeah. And then what you didn't do is just you just did that.
Ignore it, right.
You just said, this is my job.
Yeah, I'm not getting
I'm
us
not
doing
gonna
nothing,
do
that's
it.
my two co-workers, they're not even defending themselves, they just.
So, but,
Wow, so wait, so
Right
what's
down
your
deep
time?
under everything. Lord, and we put
like,
time.
that might be a strategy.
Responsible for it, so. It's the thing about it, do something when the nurse couldn't have somebody on her, come upstairs and.
Like it's there.
All make that system work, you know, like.
But yeah, it's like I'm trying to.
That was a very good learning experience.
I always worry when we look at things like.
It's like a shutdown.
I'm trying.
And everybody gets this long.
You know, skipping over.
Strategy.
Like, it doesn't matter how much I manipulate somebody. It's.
January.
But like, it's like sometimes I'm in a situation like, obviously, it's like, spending it, like, I'm just, my hands, you're not spending what I'm saying.
So I feel like.
No, it's not.
Like now. You're just like, yeah, like making it, it's just not like.
First day is off their holiday. And by then I call. For me,
We got artists, such as like, yeah, what's doing in school is a skilled nurse. There they're treating themselves as well. When like they get frustrated, as a good on the shoulders, like actually, they actually say no. But I don't, it's like that might be. But it would be like the PhD style.
What is it? If it
Would get with like depression.
Okay.
That's not.
Pretty well.
Five years. No, so honestly, maybe 5 years, like, then as a lead, I mean, really, I'm saying space.
I feel like so many supervisors should be here to pay attention to this because I feel like a lot of times they don't think.
All right, I'm gonna go there. Even if it's still pretty short, I think the question. Two people just share out and I'll have like a person. Like a reflection on what you talked about. So.
We talked about the difference between having the group meet as a whole, to sort of figure out where those stuck points are versus one-on-one conversations, but then also the idea that the leader needs to recognize that it might be them. So how can you get them to accept the feedback? And make some of the change. And yeah, but I think too, just kind of recognizing like, you know, we've pushed, right? And you are gonna act a little bit differently, so. And just trying to figure out what that is and how they can adjust, but still get, say, the work or the, you know, whatever teamwork done. What else? There's two others.
For me, as as both, like I supervise, but I supervise two people, and I'm a very low level manager in like a very large hierarchy of people. And it really highlights for me the importance of labor organizing and to like have a cohesive understanding of like what the people within the organization really want and need, because to have that cohesive understanding, to have like a fluent language between coworkers means that we can have this ability to like communicate that regulation need to the leadership. And as a leader, like I can be, that's what we were kind of talking about, like I can be as loving and like open as I want to be, but like unless I can address an issue in a real tangible way, that dysregulation is just going to keep coming up over and over again.
But it's still those micro moments that you have that can create shifts, right? So yes, I'm also in an organization, this institution that I do not have the power I wish I had to make changes. And but I can reflect on my own behaviors within the people that I interact with, right? And so yes, that may not change the leadership across multiple levels of the institution, but it does impact I surround. One more. I want to share one more. insight or aha?
Just in our group that, as we were talking, is the number 3, it's just don't avoid it. Don't just ignore it. Don't act like you don't see it.
Yeah.
You have to address it in some way, because if it's dysregulated and not productive and not beneficial to the person who's supposed to do the work, you're gonna find yourself with turnover. You know what I'm saying? It's just, if you just ignore it, it's not gonna get better.
So some of the things that you might have talked about in your group might have been the importance of naming that uncertainty, right? Rather than pretending everything's fine. That was just mentioned. The value of showing up, pausing and responding, especially in these tense moments. Something that might have came up is how easily unintentional signals like tone or pacing or silence can escalate the threat. And another one that might have come up is how powerful it can be when a leader acknowledges the emotional undercurrents without shame or without shutting them down, right? That can be that shift. So culture is a nervous system, right? In regulated environments, people feel safe. Safe enough to speak openly, to take those risks, to recover from those mistakes, and in dysregulated systems, people stay guarded. So what you just practiced is what it means to regulate a system through leadership, right? It's not about being everybody's therapist. It's not about changing what is going on. It's about being stable enough and present that people can find their footing again in order for the organization to come back together. So the future of leadership isn't about charisma or control. It's not about having all the answers. It's about how we show up when the pressure's high, when the path is unclear, and people are watching whether we'll react or stay rooted. So integrated well-being leadership is about leading with the brain in mind. It's about understanding that every interaction is shaping how people feel and how they function. So we're entering this era that requires leaders to not only be strategic, but also be relationally intelligent, to be biologically aware and emotionally grounded. What worked in the past, this top-down communication, performance at all costs, push through mindset, that doesn't work now. People are tired, they're watching, and they're deciding whether leadership still feels safe to follow. And this is where your power is. So you don't have to fix the whole system. You can interrupt that cycle of urgency, disconnection, and fear just within those micro moments. You can build that micro culture, as we just talked about, right? With trust and regulation and possibility, right where you lead, within your small groups, within the people you surround yourself. That brain needs to feel safe in order to learn, connection to perform, and trust to growth. So it's not fluff, it's physiology. And the shift from managing people to regulating systems, from extracting output to cultivating belonging, and from driving harder to leading differently is really important. So ask yourself, what kind of nervous system do I want to lead from? What kind of environment do I want to create? And what kind of future do I want to help build? Because your presence is the intervention in this organization. So as we close today, I'm going to offer you this framework that I developed. It's something to hold on to as you move forward through your leadership journey. And we've talked about each of these elements today. And this is just a collection of ideas. They're a way of being in leadership, right? One that's grounded in science, that's informed by trauma, and guided by our shared humanity. So this leadership model is called integrated well-being leadership, and it's made up of these 5 core principles. Each one is essential, not just for the individuals, but for the healthy and high-performing organizations. And each one connects back to everything we talked about today. So safety is that foundation of performance. So we start here because without safety, psychological, emotional, or relational safety, nothing else can grow within an organization. Safety doesn't mean comfort, it means predictability, it means care, and it means consistency. especially in moments of stress and uncertainty. And as a leader, we create safety through our own nervous systems. So we follow through how we listen, how we repair, and how we hold space for others to show up fully without fear. Safety is not a soft skill. It's the foundation for trust, learning, and gain. Trust is the second principle. It's the currency of leadership. So trust is built not through grand gestures, right? It's built in these small repeated moments. Do I do what I say I'll do? Do I own my own impact or my own mistakes? Do I respond with curiosity instead of control? And trust allows people to take risks, to speak up, and to stay within the organization. And when it's broken, repair is still possible. In fact, repair is essential to leadership, right? Trust is that nervous system of every team. When it's intact, everything flows. When it's fractured, everything freezes. Connection is the key to collaboration. So connection isn't optional, it's biological. Our brains and our bodies are wired to be humanly connected to others. And in our workplace, it makes collaboration, belonging, and motivation possible. So when we feel disconnected, we disengage. But when our leaders foster this connection through presence, attunement, and care, they unlock that creativity and resilience. So connection doesn't slow us down. It's what makes progress sustainable. Awareness is leading with presence and purpose. So awareness is the anchor to this trauma-informed leadership. So it's knowing what's happening in my own body, how are power and identity shaping this moment that I'm in, what's mine to hold, and what do I need to shift within the system. So awareness allows us to lead with intention instead of reaction, with humanity instead of ego. It's not just what we do that matters, it's how we show up when we're doing it. And then well-being is a leadership imperative. So well-being, not as a perk or a program, not a wellness program, right? But it's a practice. We know chronic stress erodes decision-making, it erodes empathy, and it erodes innovation. But we also know that leaders who model regulation, rest, and reflection, it shapes the culture around them. So well-being is not extra, it is essential, it is structural, it is systemic. And if we want sustainable organizations, we need sustainable leaders, right? That's why this model exists, not just to reduce harm, but to really build something better. These aren't leadership extras. They're a new core set of competencies that we need to be unfolding within our organization. And the good news is that many of you already hold this, right? I know as Mandel School social workers, as therapists, as counselors, people trained in systemic thinking, our alumni, you've really been practicing these relational leadership skills long before any of this was a buzzword, right? You are not just managers of a program, but you're drivers of culture change. And you're shaping not only what gets done, but how it gets done and how people feel in that process. So the question becomes, what kind of culture are you cultivating through your presence, your practice, and your leadership? So we covered a lot today: neuroscience, regulation, trauma responses, supervision, culture, the list goes on. But ultimately, none of it translates until you use some of it in your leadership today and tomorrow, right? So take a minute just to reflect quietly, what's one thing that you'll make what's one shift you'll make in how you lead or supervise based on what you've heard today. It could be a small thing, like pausing before you respond to stress, starting your next meeting with that grounding moment, repairing a rupture that maybe already happened that you've been avoiding, naming your capacity more clearly, making space for voice, even when there's tension. It's not about a perfect plan, it's about intention, right? So how we show up shapes how others feel, think, and connect. And I'm gonna say it again, your presence is the intervention. As a leader, that is the core intervention. We're gonna go to events. So I am going to pause here and just say thank you for being